Hi everyone. Today we are going to talk about one part of a plant. In particular, we're going to talk about the stomata. So the stomata, as you can see from these pictures, look like little openings. There's some over here in a plant. So these openings are going to let CO2 in and they're going to let water out. And that is going to cause some interesting behavior in plants and how they exchange gases. And it's also going to present a problem for plants. So we're going to take a look at the stomata today because the stomata is related to water uptake. So a little bit about leaves. Leaves have broad surface areas and a high surface area to volume ratio, right? They're flat and they're thin. And these characteristics help increase photosynthesis, right? Being flat. But having a lot of surface area also means that plants are going to lose a lot of water. And they lose water through the stomata. So we can look here. So this is a cross section of a leaf. This is the top of the leaf up here. So notice all these big green cells at the top. This is where photosynthesis happens. This is a vein. So this is part of the xylem. So water is flowing through the xylem. And at the bottom here on the underside of leaves, we have the stomata. The stomata are on the underside because this is where water vaporizes and leaves a leaf. If it was on the top where the sun was hitting it, it would happen a little bit too fast. So the stomata are usually on the bottom to make this process a little bit slower. Notice how the water is leaving through the stomata. And as it says here, about 95% of the water escapes through the stomata. Now, that's not the only function of the stomata. Not only does water escape, but this is also how carbon dioxide gets into a plant. So it's a two-way door. Water's leaving, CO2 is entering, and that will be important to remember. Water is essential for plant metabolism, but it's always being lost. And so there's these two conflicting requirements from a plant. First of all, we want to minimize water loss. How would we minimize water loss? Well, you may be thinking we can just close the stomata, and you would be correct. Closing the stomata will minimize water loss. But we also have to admit carbon dioxide into the plant. So how are we going to admit CO2? Well, we've got to open the stomata. So the stomata cannot be open and closed at the same time. We have to have it open during certain times and closed during the other because we need to minimize water loss, but we also need to let in CO2. So we have the stomata to help regulate that. And the plant also has a waxy cuticle on the leaves. Some leaves are very waxy. Some leaves are only kind of waxy, but that is going to help reduce water loss. Okay, so on a short-term basis, so notice that it says short-term. Closing the stomata can control water loss. So when it is really hot and dry, you can expect the stomata of a plant to be closed. This occurs in many types of plants when they are subjected to water stress, but this cannot last forever because a plant must have CO2 to undergo photosynthesis. So it can't work on the long term. Here we see a picture of the stomata open, and it's hot and dry, so here the stomata has closed. All right, so let's make sure that we know what's going on. Our first question, why is closing the stomata beneficial? And then our other question, what is the drawback of having the stomata closed? Take a minute to answer these questions. All right, so for the first one, closing the stomata is beneficial because it prevents water loss. You should have said something about that. And number two, what is the drawback of having the stomata closed? It is going to prevent CO2 from entering, which is bad for the plant. All right, good. So what is the structure of a stomata? Each stoma, or opening, is flanked by a pair of guard cells. The guard cells are here, or there, and there. Those are guard cells. The stoma is the opening. We're just going to refer to the entire thing as a stomata. Changes in turgor pressure are going to open and close the stomata. So when water goes into the guard cells, so water is flowing in, the guard cells are going to inflate and become turgid. So the stomata are going to open. So kind of like little water wings you might have had as a kid. When they are inflated, they're open. When we send water out of the guard cells are going to become flaccid and the stomata are going to close. They're going to deflate. Here we see almost a closed stomata because water has left the guard cells. The guard cells have shriveled up. So how can we get these guard cells to inflate and deflate? Well, we've got to use osmosis, right? But how do we control osmosis? Well, we're going to control osmosis using potassium ions. When it is time, when a cell senses that we better open up the stomata, we need some CO2, the cell is going to pump potassium ions into the guard cells in a high concentration. Having lots of potassium ions is going to lower the solute potential. So the solute potential is going to go down, and that is going to mean water wants to flow into the guard cells, inflating them. When it's time, maybe it's hot and dry, it's time to close the stomata, the cell is going to move the potassium ions out of the guard cells, and that is going to raise the water potential of the guard cells. So the guard cells now have a higher water potential. So they have a higher water potential, they have a higher solute potential, water is going to move out, and the guard cells are going to shrivel and close. So it is going to be pretty important that you understand how these stomata work. So again, potassium in, water follows, the stomata open, or potassium leaves, water leaves, the stomata shrinks. You should be able to describe this in terms of potassium and water, but also in terms of water potential. All right, so here we have the information you need. Uptake of potassium ions by guard cells, that is done by proton pumps. Water is going to enter the cell by osmosis, and the guard cells are going to become turgid. Then we're going to lose potassium ions from the guard cells. The water is going to leave by osmosis, and the guard cells are going to become flaccid. So one way and then the opposite. All right, so here is our question to make sure we know what's going on. What mechanism does a plant use to close its stomata? You should answer this now. All right, so to close its stomata, a plant cell is going to move out the potassium ions, which is going to raise the water potential in the guard cells. And that is going to mean the water moves through osmosis out of the guard cells. The guard cells will shrivel and close the stomata. Good. Okay, and there we have a review of everything we just talked about. So how exactly does the plant know what's happening? Well, light is often a trigger. There are blue light receptors. So when a plant is exposed to a lot of blue light, that tells the plant that there is a lot of light. And so that is going to trigger a response from the guard cells and cause the stomata to open, because they want to be open during the day, because during the day is when photosynthesis happens. They can also sense the amount of CO2. So with CO2 being depleted, we need to open the guard cells. There's also an automatic circadian rhythm to the plants. And then there's chemical responses. Abscisic acid is one. We'll talk about this much later in the year. But this is going to recognize when there's a drought and maybe we need to close the stomata. So we can use these things to figure out if a guard cell should be open or closed. The plant has cues. All right, and that is all for today. We'll go over this again later. So if you have any questions, let me know.